Am I on? We're going to go back over the '07 budget. And I wanted to get input from the departments on a variety of items. I guess when you get a second bite at the apple, sometimes you might change things. All right. Thank you. The first item I'd like to see, is Marcia here first? I wanted to ask you a couple questions, one in particular on the early care and learning budget. We took the governor's recommendation and transferred funds to fund an additional 1,586 slots, which I believe was the number you had recommended and the governor used. If we changed how we did the amended budget and did not fund additional slots in '07, what would be the effect of that? Further question. Thank you. Could you just target the reduction in funding to those 1,586 slots, or would you, or do you need to? Right.
So if there's children that are already there that are being paid with the expectation, then the amended budget is going to be there and they'll be able to pay them, and that's going to be always ask for continuing funding children and funding slots. And so all of our programs are under the assumption where the children are in those classrooms that they will be able to continue with the funding. So some children would have to go home before the school year is out. Because we cut it all off, and when you got rid of that numbers and we broke them down. But, the reality is we have to come up. Somebody's going to lose on it.
Right. Right. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Yes.
So does that mean that those 1,586 students would no longer be able to continue in the program, and possibly some other students who had already been solidified in the program would also?
Yeah, because those children are spread out across the state in different programs. We're not going to take one child out of a program classroom and say, you can't go anymore. Well, we could, but that wouldn't be very wise. You would really look at which classrooms are closest to finishing up the school year and, close those classes out. I mean, we'd have to really sit down and think about that hard. Children would not get to complete. How many children? You could either look at all the children wouldn't be able to complete it, because the choices of who's going to have it, who's not, that's a pretty tough choice to have to make. Or we know some children would be impacted, period, because we wouldn't have enough money to complete school years in some programs.
Thank you.
Further question, Marcia. In thinking if we are going to go to a system whereby we don't look at the budget twice a year, but in fact just once a year, do you have any thoughts on how that would change how you budget or what recommendations you make? Because you would need to anticipate how many students, say for the '08 budget, realizing that you can't come back. What would that? How would you accommodate that?
One thing that we're trying to do is to get better data. But with this population of birth, even for birth to 4-year-olds, it's very, very difficult to get exact numbers. We also see population shifts in counties. So it's hard to really make a concrete estimate of how many 4-year-olds are in that county. Different counties, we definitely see changes in counties. Thank you. How many children would actually be in that county to serve? What we would do is we'd have to, really work, continue with getting the best data we can actually get and make high projections.
I guess you'd make high projections, but with a cap, right? So that if,
Oh, yes, we'd all, yes.
unlike what you've done in the
Yes.
past, you come back, treat it like public
Yes.
school students, where
Yes.
whereby we generally, at least to today, we fund whomever comes through the doors. You'd make a high projection, and then that'd be it.
If that was our instructions, that's exactly what we would do. But we would have to make, because, we're not guaranteed every kid's going to be served. So, we have to make those higher projections. That's right.
Thank you. All right, I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, moving on to Department of Education. Let's see, I don't know who wants to answer it, Scott. Stuart.
We'll brother this thing.
I'm looking here under central office. Let's see, the governor has add funds to extend the consultant contract for the governor's education finance task force. So
Yes.
is that an item that could wait till 08 if we needed to?
Madam Chair, actually, I would recommend not, and the reason is the IE2 task force is taking a little bit longer. The original concept was that we would have this model done last year, and we ended up spending more time in our community conversations and getting some of the education partners. We currently have a contract we've just entered into with this vendor. There are three deliverables, and I would say at least a third of that contract will be due at the end of this month when they deliver that final deliverable for the elementary school best practices model. I think that it's very important from the governor's perspective and from our perspective on trying to keep the IE2 task force working so that we can have recommendations to the General Assembly next year. By cutting the contract and waiting until August, it means that the two very important deliverables that relate to the middle school cost model and the high school cost model would most likely not be available in a timely fashion to inform the General Assembly and the governor's office for the next year's budget cycle.
And actually, on the most aggressive timeline that we've seen, all three of the best practices models are supposed to be done by late June. So clearly, we could be really 80% into this contract before the fiscal year ends. And that's our concern, because the final report needs to come out in an October, November time frame in order for the legislature to be able to, for any legislation to be developed next session.
Thank you. There's another item, $665,000. The governor recommended the House concurred to add funds to support the operation of the student information system. Could we wait on that?
Actually, again, the answer would be no, and the reason is that this is actually for operations and maintenance funding that is specific to the student information system that was finished earlier this year. I suspect the only reason I know the reason we didn't have it in the beginning continuation budget was because the student information system project was not yet complete at the time we were doing the budget last year, and so the governor's office appropriately decided not to put in a number for O&M until after we had that project completed, so that we would have better negotiation room to whittle down the number. As it stands on the $14 million project, that $600,000 is relatively low for what we typically see in O&M. This is actually a recurring payment, part of which is licensing, part of which is the work that's part of the maintenance for this the student information system, and it's something that will be paid this year and next year and future years.
One thing you said caught my attention. So when the governor, it sounds like, and you and your budgeting were expecting that we would come back and amended, probably not just on this item, but on other items, and be able to put perhaps the more accurate figure in, as opposed to projecting high a year ago.
Yes.
With the expectation that there would be no opportunity to change it.
Correct.
That's right.
And so changing, not midstream, but into stream
Right.
in the budget process would affect not just this item, but a number of other items.
And that was part of why we were able to keep the initial development costs lower, because we didn't invent the wheel with the student information system. We used proprietary software. But with that, we also were very clear in the beginning that there's going to be annual ongoing operations and maintenance costs, because we spent so much less on the front end. And so that we're close. We're in the ballpark of what that'll be each time.
Any other questions on those items? Curriculum development, about $630,000 to provide funds to develop 255 instructional video clips for the online Georgia Performance Standards training. Can we wait on that? Are you anticipating getting these? Would it interfere by waiting a few months and starting the development of them at that point, or are you trying to get them in place before next school year?
Well, that's part of the issue that we have. As you know, professional learning has to be ramped up to start as soon as the teachers are out of school in many cases. And by holding off until really a July time frame to develop it, as you know, with the way most school systems have gone, teachers are coming back to work in late July. We're afraid we'll lose a whole professional learning cycle out of this. And this is the year that we implement the beginnings of the 9-12 math, and it's very important that we have the professional learning out there. And that's why we even had it put in the midterm budget at all.
National board certification, I know you were put that information, you were only able to put that information together fairly late, and so we plugged in what we could. I realize that's not the total amount. If we do not put in the funds for that national board certification total amount in the amended, do the teachers lose that money, or what would be?
Certainly, some teachers would lose the money.
If you're retiring.
Our first review would be
quitting.
And also, if you're in a system that is really struggling with the budget, which most are right now. I mean, some systems would go ahead and fund this because of, obviously, they've got an agreement with those teachers that if they get this certification, they'll get paid, and they would certainly reach deep to find the funds. But as you know, many of our systems are really stressed financially right now, and I'm afraid that some of our systems couldn't afford to even pass on any amounts to the teachers right now.
All right. Well, under non-quality basic education grants, the House fully funded the amount that we had agreed to fund for the children in foster care residential homes. As we discussed, there's 26 of these private facilities serving close to about 1,000 children. They're not state taxpayer, they don't have taxes coming in unless we appropriate those taxes. Is there any concern as to what that might do to
Well, because of the
facilities?
nature of when we started last spring, once this legislation was signed into law, we still hadn't fully identified all of the students and systems where 618 would have applied to those students that were either DHR or DJJ was responsible for them. And once we did that, we only had the state QBE funds to go with. When we moved forward, we realized that DHR was paying an educational supplement for the education of these children, even though they didn't have a line item for it. They were in essence going into deficit to pay this. And what they did is they paid some $22 out of a $200 a day expense for these students who received 24/7 treatment. Well, what we didn't realize until we got into it is that these education funds were being expended at a rate of, in many cases, for 300 days, 365 days a year. And as you know, education funds don't flow 365 days a year. Because also the fact that in the final version of the bill, local systems were held harmless for their portion, for any local funds for these students, it did leave a shortfall. We thought the shortfall originally was going to be much greater than it was, but as we began to look at the actuals and the expenses from these treatment centers, it was arrived this $1.4 million or $1 million expenditure was going to meet the needs for this year. The systems will fall short. I mean, these local residential treatment centers will fall short of being able to fully operate without these funds.
I know under QBE we had a number of systems that, you know, when you're dealing with so many systems, it's natural that you have some minor errors, and these were fairly minor errors, but there were 6 schools that got miscalculated under the middle school, or I call it junior high school program, and then T&E for Chickamauga, and then the Downing Clark residential, which was left out altogether. I suppose if we went to a system whereby, beginning today, we only funded, I think the 3 things that have been suggested are Peach Care, the tornado, effects from the tornado, disaster relief, and the midterm adjustment for public education, that these would be omitted from changing. I guess from an accounting standpoint, we could make it up next year if we...
Madam Chair, if I may, what I would say is that these actually are part of the midterm adjustment. These are QBE specific. So
these might
theoretically, these are FTEs, and these really would have been included in the governor's numbers that we turned in, except there were some errors in what we turned into the governor, which were the basis for the midterm reserve. So as a just theoretically, they are actually part and parcel of that. The mistake should really have been reported to the governor, and had we done that, they would have been part of his original submission.
And because with these residential treatment centers, we literally worked with 25 individual school systems on memorandums of understanding, because each one of these centers seemed to have a unique situation. Of one thing they had in common is not one of these centers had ever worked with state funding before. And it took us several months to fully flesh out and then work with these residential treatment centers and how to even report in order to obtain state funding. And we're still working out the accountability with the school systems now. So really, in light of how many centers we worked with, to have had one where there was just some inaccurate reporting, and it was just a matter of the fact that the school system didn't have all of the numbers in time to make the early October FTE count. By mid-October they had it, but by that time the budget had already come over. So we really had a 99.9% batting rate in all of that, batting average in that.
So you would make the case with the Senate that these would fit that definition of having a limited...
Yes, Madam Chair. We
Yes.
have actually in some hearings, and we will continue to do so.
The repairs for the state schools, I guess if they've waited this long, we could wait until 08.
And that's an area where clearly, I mean, we need to make sure we don't lose sight of those funds between the budgets. But as you know, we can contract through the summer on those if we need to. And I am checking today to see if there are any emergency allocations, like broken heating and air units or leaking roofs or issues like that we were repairing. And I'm not aware of any at this point.
What about the 23.32.2 increased funding properly reflect training and experience for state school teachers? Could that wait?
Well, which one is
There's
it?
127,000.
That relates really to the current year's funding of teachers for their T&E, because as we've talked about, and this I would say theoretically is part and parcel as well. These 3 state schools do not actually report FTEs, and so there's no mechanism for them to adjust in the teachers' natural growth.
Now, the legislature, as you know, there are separate appropriations for the state schools, and they, as closely as we can, we match the same type of funding for them, and that's what we're doing, is we're simply adjusting the training and experience for the new hires that we've made in the last year from the state schools.
So would you consider that a part of the midterm adjustment?
Absolutely. We always have in the past.
And Under testing, increasing the funds for the AP and the PSAT,
Flex growth.
would that be a problem to hold off until next year if we need to?
I would, Madam Chair, if I may, we in the past have done that with the vendor, which is College Board, and they actually ended up in a deficit one of these particular years. I believe that was 03 or 04. As a result, they look to the budget line as positive confirmation that the state is putting in the portions for the tests. If they don't see it in the budget line, what they've done and what they did last year, if it wasn't in the budget line, they will bill the schools, and the schools will then bill the parents. And I think from our perspective, that's problematic because the timing is such that parents are not expecting to pay for it. It's really not a matter of the cost. In all instances, sometimes it's just a matter of the bureaucracy, and we'd be very concerned about a student showing up to take a test and not being able to do so because the payment wasn't made on his or her behalf.
Any other specific questions on the other side? All right. We move to 08.
Ready for that?
Move to, is Marcia still here?
She just left now.
She's left, all right. Any questions on the 08? We voted this out, but we may have an opportunity to open it back up. Okay. I'm sure we do, if we want to. Let's see if we have any questions. Let me ask another question, Scott. If we were to agree to follow the Senate's suggestion on changing how we do 07, then of course we'd have to go back, open up 08, and make modifications. I suppose we'd need to work together, but you would need to go back and change what you would put in 08 along with the governor's people in terms of what your recommendations would be. Is that right?
Yes, Madam Chair,
Those items
that
out
is
of
correct.
07. Some of them might fall by the wayside because it'd be too late, but others you would build into the 08 and would just be delayed. Is that right?
Yes, and I don't wish to be presumptive to talk about the theory of how you all do the budgets, but I would say that in addition to the midterm adjustment from our perspective, and this is what I think Marcia Moore was referring to, sometimes there's what we think is a very legitimate mechanism to actually put in a more appropriate number for many of the line items where we are at the beginning of the year only projecting what we think the number will be, and we've worked with the governor's office. And in the past, the governor has said he doesn't like to see, he really was not wanting to see projecting on the high side. His preference would be project where we think it might be, and then we'll adjust upward if we need to based on the actuals. Madam Chair, specifically to your question, if we don't have the opportunity to adjust based on actuals in the midterm and then next year's budget, we do in fact need to, I would say, increase the beginning budgets for a number that will be fairly uncertain. But as a practical matter, if we don't have the opportunity to adjust upward in the midterm based on better numbers, from our perspective, we absolutely would need to adjust those numbers upward at the beginning of the year if we didn't have an opportunity to do so in the midterm for those formulaic type budget items where we don't really know the appropriate number, the actual number at the beginning of the year.
All right.
Scott, what that would actually do if we're planning on going toward that route, then we, in the 08 budget, we would have to budget for the supplemental 07 rollovers, plus we would have to take into account supplemental 08 rollovers. So in other words, we'd have to take two lumps in the same budget in order to get it. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir, it does, although and I think it's a matter of timing as to when you transition into the new way of thinking. Clearly, in the year that you're changing the thinking such that you don't have an opportunity to adjust in the midterm, you're going to have to roll over this year's items that weren't appropriately funded per the actuals into next year where we can do that. and then also increase next year's beginning base by that number. In future years, once you've adjusted the beginning base in that new, after having transitioned, then you wouldn't have to keep rolling it over.
But then we wind up in the problem of going over the projected income or revenue for the state, which we can't do.
Well, clearly there's a revenue consideration, and frankly, that's part of the midterm adjustment. Is that I know the governor's office works to amend the revenue projection, which we don't participate in. Obviously, we're recipients of that, but that's certainly part of the governor's package when he puts together the budget, is what the new numbers are indicating about the revenue.
Neil.
If we take this approach and you project high, what do you do? Now, Marcia, when I asked this question, said, well, we'll have to put a cap and just quit accepting students. But what do you do in DOE if you exceed those projections, even though you may have projected high? What happens at that point? Local school systems will have to...
Well, frankly, it would depend on what the budget item is. For example, national board certification, certain teachers are going to be affected. And in the year, we would have to consider, are these new teachers, are we going to share it among all the teachers, et cetera. For the AP or PSAT, it would be those students who were taking the test at the time. Again, the question would be, when would we know we have the deficit? And frankly, with national board, you've seen the lateness of the numbers. It doesn't give us a lot of time to react. If we had more time to react, we could react during the operating year to adjust downward, and we would be looking to do that. But we would still be in a vulnerable position, and frankly, the reason we don't have the numbers nailed down better at the beginning of the year is because they are volatile. And clearly, because we're coming to you in the midterm, clearly we don't know what the numbers are going to be. And when the state is growing as it is, the volatility is higher. Now, if we go back to years of slow growth, it's a lot easier to manage what those numbers are going to be.
So for the formula, and the formula meaning the per student funding, we're fine, because that's that is always allowed, and that's why basically why we're here, really working on the midterm, is the public school what we call midterm adjustment. But for other ancillary items, all these other things that we provide, like national certification or AP, that's where the problem would come. Is if you only get one bite of the apple, you're a little off. It seems like just like with a family, but if your budgeting process only occurred once, but you're actually going to have to assume that you're going to budget a little less closely because there's no room for error. I mean, if we were here once a month making changes, you theoretically could budget more tightly and follow the actual. We get two opportunities to do it. If we were to go to one, we really do have to project, I think, more generally and more less aggressively. Put a bigger number in there just in case.
Yes, Madam Chair, and I'm sure you've seen them, but it might be good to just for people interested to peruse the governor's instructions for the midterm budget. He was actually very clear that he was not looking for growth items. His recommendations were for items that were formulaic, that are growth related, that are emergency in nature, that are where there's a compelling reason. So I will say that we actually have already run that gauntlet to some extent, and those items that you're seeing here that are increasing, we believe are increasing for good reason, and we've convinced the governor's office as well of that. Yeah, if we tighten it down even further, I do believe what you're saying is that we'll end up with a number that's probably going to be, if we were guessing, we would guess on the high side, so that we don't end up having to short teachers or tell parents they can't take the test, or whomever would be affected by a shortfall.
I had a question for John Brown. John, I don't know how many governors you've worked with. Four governors? Four governors. How are we doing it differently than under the other governors in all the years you've worked on the budget? And can you comment on this proposal? How, I'd just like to hear your thoughts on the proposal versus how it's been done and how we've been working the budget under Governor Perdue.
At various times there have been debate about limiting the amended budget to just the must-do items. But usually when you get there, you find that there's a bigger list of must-do needed items than just the 3 or 4 things that have been mentioned. Throughout the budget, judicial, public defenders, that's an item that pops up. We've got the pre-K issue here with more kids showing up. So you just find that you have more things to deal with. Now, as far as how 4 governors have dealt with this, same way at various times, most of those 4 governors felt like, I want to keep the amended budget to what must be done. But then once they settle into the job a year or two, they find out that there's a whole lot that has to be done. So we've never transitioned to anything in this Marine Corps. But what you're dealing with now is really no different than what I've seen over the last 20-plus years. You're dealing with the same type of items. Let me say, too, that it's not always about emergencies or needs. Sometimes there's timing opportunities. Sometimes you have a need for a project and funding today to take advantage of land that's been offered or something that's going on. So to say hardcore that it's just going to be emergencies and these certain K-12 needs, you may miss out on some opportunities to leverage your money if you close your eyes to what's on.
It seems just in listening to what Scott was saying that in Stewart, that if we were to ever go to something and redefine what need is and what would qualify, whether it's very narrowly interpreted or generally interpreted, maybe more narrowly than how we did for this budget and the last few under Governor Perdue, that you would want to start that process with the big budget, not come in at the tail end when agencies have perhaps put in very conservative numbers for certain items, or thinking like with some that, we'll put in what's needed now and come back later if we have to. Can you comment on the timing?
Let me just answer it this way. Representative England made the point that if we do this now, we have to rethink some of the projects in 07 and shift them to 08. We have to stick with what we had in 08, and we have to look ahead, as Scott said, to maybe building in some larger numbers if we're going to shut this process off for the amended 08. So you've got a lot of rethinking to do, and the notion that we just want to look at it differently, and at the end of the day, everybody will get the projects that they're interested in or what have you, there won't be enough money to fit that. You won't be able to go back and revisit your 08 base numbers and build in enough cushion to cut off amended as well as roll projects over. Something will happen.
You basically have 11 legislative days to completely revamp how we do the big budget, and would have lost opportunity because we didn't start this in 07 with the 07 big budget. There would be folks that would be cut off or left in the cold, programs or projects that we wouldn't fund because we would have missed that opportunity.
Just my opinion for what it's worth, but if this is a decision that's to be made that we want to do this, there has to be a transition period for a year or so. You have to say, all right, this will be our last amended budget when we take care of some things. We will start the big budget like we need, but we might need one more amended budget to try to get it right, and then we'll try to settle into a new way of doing business. I don't think you can do it this way.
Given we only have 11 legislative days left, and many of us have completed our work under the old parameters for the 08 budget, as did the governor's office and every agency, it would seem that the earliest we really want to begin to make that transition would be with the 09 budget. And it also seems that you wouldn't want to define what could be accommodated in the midterm overly narrowly, because there are other items that could be needed beyond just the midterm adjustment and the disaster that we'd be, I think, not really using the taxpayers' dollars right if we tighten it down like that. Businesses, and we try, how do we run this like a business? Well, even less like a business by limiting ourselves that much, because business makes adjustments daily. But we would artificially hamstring ourselves from doing that. Thank you. Any other questions? I'd like to ask OPB to comment as well. Could we ask you a couple questions on behalf of the governor's office?
I'm going to be somewhat limited because I actually haven't had a chance to talk with the director of OPB and really have the true points of the governor.
Okay. Well, let me ask this: when you when y'all put together the 07 budget and now the 08, did you anticipate that is how what has been proposed by the Senate is how we would in fact handle the amended budgets for those 2 years?
No, we started working on budgets in September and did not have that.
So a year ago, September, in the 07, since that's the one we're dealing with, right, a year and a half ago, under an expectation that we would use our best judgment, you and the legislature, in how we define need and what, not new programs, but accommodating a definition of need that was a bit looser than just disaster and midterm adjustment. Could we accomplish that in the next few weeks on the 08 budget, go back and redo it, realizing, as Representative pointed out, that we would need to fold into it items from 07 and anticipate that there would be no amended budget in 08 in which to change?
Probably a very hard task. Between OPB and the House, we've been working on the budget for 6 months.
Thank you. Any other questions? Questions, Representative? All right. Well, any comments from the audience? Anyone have any suggestions? How to do this in 11 days if we have to? If not, I'm going to adjourn. Thank you.